one man that I definitely wanted in that room, and though he wasn't there that day, I wanted to kind of pick his brain on this because he's an absolute expert on the networks, on the money, on connecting the dots, and his name is Mike Benz. He joins us now. What's up, Mike?
How you doing, Jack? Great to see you.
So, Benz, we spent a lot of time while we were in there talking about, for my part, I talked about how the violence is getting worse, how we see these tactics moving now more towards assassinations as opposed to the traditional black bloc protests or the violence against, a random Starbucks or random cars, that type of thing. We're now seeing more and more targeted violence, including asymmetric threats such as assassinations. I even went on CNN and walked them through this. I'm not sure if they understood, but I tried to do what I could to explain it to CNN. But Benz, when we hear the response from these types, they say, well, Antifa is decentralized. There's no network there. That's just a group of people organically fighting fascism. Is that true?
Not even in the slightest. Go to any one of these Antifa websites, although they're getting rarer and rarer as so many of them are starting to shut down right now to try to hide their own secrets. But they all have .org as their websites. The Portland Antifa site is a .org. The Torch Antifa site is a .org. The Seattle cell is a .org. Jack, what is org short for?
Well, that's short for organization, or specifically nonprofit organization.
Yes, these are organized organizations. This is not some ethereal, metaphysical idea. They are organized organizations, and they operate through a cluster cell network, which is the part and parcel of how we do influence operations abroad. And this kind of gets to the broader Antifa story. Antifa is an international network, and one way to understand it and to try to depoliticize it a little bit for a second here, there were very radical, right-wing, decentralized cluster cells of networks for political influence operations and brass knuckles, breaking up meetings, acts of domestic terrorism that were conducted in the 20th century under what's known today as Operation Gladio. This was a NATO network of stay-behind groups, paramilitary street militias in Italy, in Central and Eastern Europe. There were dozens of these cluster cells that were organized in a decentralized fashion where it brought together basically captains of industry, government regulators, international aid organizations, and then violent political, at the time, right-wing anti-communist forces that were secretly working with the Central Intelligence Agency and NATO's political affairs units in order to nudge domestic politics country by country in the emerging soup of the democratic turbulence post-World War II from the 1940s to the early 1990s. And this was done because we were fighting a Cold War against international communism, and these stay-behind networks, which were licensed to do dirty work and were on the ground, in the streets, were essentially sanctioned by U.S. and NATO intelligence to do a Department of Dirty Tricks of violent activities, often, in order to stop the emergence of left-wing communism. I believe the best way to understand Antifa and its various connective tissues at the foundation level, at the nonprofit level, and at the U.S. government level is as a left-wing counter-populist faction organized with a very similar structure and for a very similar purpose that the right-wing anti-communist cluster cells were set up internationally during the Cold War. The difference is the American people have not known until just the past few years that this type of structure even existed, or that we were even in a kind of second Cold War against international Trumpism in the way that there was an initial Cold War against international communism.
And so you've got these leave-behind networks, you've got them bounced out. And by the way, and you and I have talked about this, that's exactly what I told the president when I was in the room. I pointed out that all of this goes back to World War II. It even predates World War II. If you look at the way that Antifa was used as the international arm of the Bolsheviks to destabilize countries like revolutionary Spain and like the Weimar Republic. And certainly we all saw what the destabilization of the Weimar Republic turned into if you go back to the 1920s, 1930s. But it was always meant to be the international arm of the revolution, funded by the Russian people, funded by looting the Russian treasury. And so you fast forward that to the Cold War era, and they were using it for the exact same thing. So when President Trump brought up that question, should they be designated a foreign terrorist organization, you'll notice that I was the first one. I said, yes, Mr. President, absolutely. They have networks all across Western Europe. And in fact, people are looking at it a little bit backwards if they think that Antifa started here. No, no, no. Antifa started in Western and Eastern Europe and then came to the United States, not the other way around. That's why these leave behind networks are so important, and that's the way they were set up in the very first instance.
That's exactly right, and it's a seamless interchange, as you've covered. Mark Bray is the Antifa professor at, I believe, Rutgers, and then as soon as he feels he's running into legal trouble, tries to flee to Spain to join up with cluster networks there. And there is this kind of, I think Michael Lowenthal, another Antifa professor and organizer, described in one of his books, he called it networked clandestiny, this kind of secrecy and this cluster cell organization they refer to as a network of networks. This is the exact same language, by the way, that NATO used during the Integrity Initiative, where they targeted right-wing nationalist forces in Spain. Pedro Baños, famously, his nomination to be the security director, the military head in Spain, was nuked by a clandestine operation by NATO called the Integrity Initiative, of which, according to the documents, both Anne Applebaum and Nina Jankovic were a part of. They were part of the UK inner cluster cell of this NATO-funded secret influence network. And if you look country by country in Europe and around the world, it is impossible to disentangle the goals of Antifa and the goals of the Joe Biden, Barack Obama, CIA, State Department, and USAID. Look at, for example, what Antifa does in Germany, targeting the AfD party, the right-wing populist party there. Look at what they do in Spain, targeting the Vox party. Look at what they do in France, targeting Marine Le Pen. Look at what they do in Brazil, targeting Bolsonaro. Look at what they do in Belarus, targeting Lukashenko. It is impossible to see a lick of daylight between the foreign policy goals of the Central Intelligence Agency under Joe Biden and Barack Obama and the on-the-ground domestic political actions of Antifa as a kind of street muscle. It's all the way down to the to the commercial investments of the political donors to the DNC. As George Soros and Bill Gates and Tom Steyer and Al Gore and all of these billionaires with multi-billion-dollar assets under investment management funds are promoting things like climate change and shifting profits within the global energy market to portfolio companies that require government mandates to wean off of fossil fuels and into renewables or ethanol-based fuels. George Soros and Al Gore and Tom Steyer and this entire DNC investor class are pre-invested in those markets, while Antifa serves as an eco-fascist battering ram to promote those stocks. The same thing in the public health space. Look at how Antifa breaks up anti-vaccine protests. They're the paramilitary arm of Pfizer.
Exactly. And they don't even realize it half the time because they aren't in that part of the cluster. What should the federal government be doing and where should they be looking in terms to break up these networks, to disrupt these operations, and ultimately to stop these activities from destroying our society like the cancer that it is?
I consider Antifa and U.S. government adjacencies to it to be part of the weaponization toolkit that the Biden administration used that spanned lawfare, FBI targeting and the like. I consider paramilitary street violence and the condoning of it, or the tactical tacit blessings for it to be a part of that weaponization toolkit. And Tulsi Gabbard at ODNI just stood up a interagency working group on weaponization of intelligence and foreign affairs type functions. This spans ODNI, CIA, State Department, USAID, FBI, DHS, and other equities. I believe that, for example, search terms can be inputted into internal searches at USAID, the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, and you can start right there and simply put in terms like Antifa or anti-fascist or authoritarian in these type terms, and start with a basic review of all files around, for example, energy policy in Germany. The Biden administration blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. The Antifa groups in Germany were champing at the bit for that and have been used as a battering ram against the AfD party there. We were giving tens of millions of dollars in aid to various organizations within Germany. You can start right there and simply look for all Antifa adjacencies blessed by the foreign policy establishment, or used or even had peripheral awareness by CIA, State Department, USAID, with Antifa networks that were going against those agencies' political enemies. I think it is impossible that there are no linkages there. You start with that, and you make it sunlight, the best disinfectant. These networks rely on secrecy. Now, what you'll hear from the national security state is, you can't disclose the involvement of the U.S. government and Antifa in Germany because then no other dissident group will want to work with the United States, knowing that their cover will be blown because the U.S. government betrayed these Antifa groups by disclosing internal memos and conversations with various leaders on the ground. I say that is complete BS. If you use this as a sword abroad, for example, if you use Antifa networks to go after the AfD party in Germany or Marine Le Pen's movement in France, you can't use that secrecy as a shield at home because Antifa operates here at home. So I think it starts with taking the lid off of the den of vipers, the cage that they've been with classification, and simply exposing the snakes inside to sunlight. Given how the layers of secrecy and OPSEC that Antifa moves through, that itself will have a tremendous on-the-ground impact in those countries themselves, potentially violating FARA-type laws. And if these were not disclosed in accordance with each country's process. For example, we know that Syria units were, according to Rolling Stone, the closest allies on the ground of the U.S. military in Syria, as we were backing the ISIS and al-Qaeda forces against Bashar al-Assad. We know, because the military was working directly with these Antifa units, we know that there is connective tissue between the U.S. military, the Central Intelligence Agency, and Antifa in Syria. Does anyone doubt those linkages in Germany or France or in other European and Latin American countries? If you do,
and Mike, by the way, those linkages that you're talking about, the foreign fighter flows that we saw traveling to YPG and other affiliates, it wasn't just American Antifa that were coming. They were sourcing them from Germany. They were sourcing them from Greece. They were using that area of northeastern Syria as a training ground for Antifa to receive battlefield experience. And in fact, I know of at least one individual who received that battlefield training and then traveled back to in 2019, then traveled back to the United States to participate in what? The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, where he was manning the armed barricades in Chaz in Seattle just a year later.
That's right. They go straight from targeting the CIA's enemies abroad to the CIA's political enemies here at home. That's how this international network works, and the capacity building for it moves through foundations. And this is really the layer that I think would break this whole thing open. You take a place like the Tide Center. The Tide Center, which gives the 501c3 to the Black Lives Matter Global Action Group and to many of these Antifa funding pass-throughs. The Tide Center, as I've documented, has gotten about $27 million in U.S. State Department and USAID grants for some very peculiar things, including the Tide Center getting a $2.5 million grant to, quote, secure concrete commitments from foreign governments on behalf of the U.S. State Department. And this is the group that is giving the 501c3 to a nonprofit status, the fiscal sponsor to these Antifa groups and these BLM street muscle groups in 2020. how is this foundation serving as the shadow diplomat formally for the U.S. government internationally and getting funded
They need
tens
to
of
be
millions of
fully
dollars to do it?
investigated. Mike Benz,
We need
we're
all
up
those
against
records
a hard out.
declassified.
Declassify all of it.